Thank you, Steve. And I'll just say a quick word of thanks also to the choir. That was a beautiful song that was sung and certainly was well done. It's a joy to be with you today. As the bulletin says, my name is Brian Trainer, and I'll give you just a little bit of kind of a context. This is actually not the first time that I've had the privilege standing behind this particular pulpit. Many years ago, actually over a dozen years ago, the Lord brought my wife and I to Clearwater to work at Clearwater Christian College. So I had the joy of working there for a period of time, and so even as I stand here and look out, I see some familiar faces, and that's always encouraging. And what's nice is that they actually have been kind to me in the time that I've been here, so that's a good thing too, and that I would include Gary Smith in that. But it really is. It's great to be in this context. And when Dr. McIntyre asked about the possibility of coming down for a Sunday, it was something that I readily agreed to because of the good memories of what God has done in my life in this area, and also the joy to be able to minister to this local body. Right now, I actually serve as the dean at Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary up in Detroit, Michigan. And just to give you a little bit of a sense, because this is going to kind of move right into the context of the message this morning, being at Detroit is something new for me. My wife and I have been involved in both pastoral ministry. I've been a pastor for over 20 years, and in the last 15 years, I've been involved in Christian education. We have been at Clearwater and at a couple of other Christian colleges, 9 years at Maranatha Baptist Bible College, or Maranatha Baptist University now in Watertown, Wisconsin. And just this last summer, we made the transition out of Wisconsin into Detroit. Now, I'll just give you a little bit of a context of what that's like. This is something that we actually had prayed about for about 2 years as the opportunity was there, and yet we did not sense the Lord had given us a release from our ministry there in Watertown. Watertown's a small little community, and the Lord had provided a home for my wife and I kind of out in the country such that every morning we could wake up and there would be deer in our backyard. And every night we would sit out on the back porch, at least during the summertime. Obviously, Wisconsin, you don't sit outside in the wintertime at all. But we would look out the back porch there, and there would be deer kind of eating in our backyard, and there was a little stream in the backyard. And it was just a wonderful opportunity by way of house. But more than that, the Lord, about 6 years ago, there was actually one of my students, his name was David, approached me and said, I'm thinking about planting a church outside of Milwaukee, which was about 20 minutes away. And he asked if I would be willing to join him. So myself and David, at that point a 22-year-old, and then another family started the Bible study in a home, and from that Bible study established a local church in the area. And I'll simply say, from my perspective, there is nothing more exciting. And even as Dr. McIntyre said this morning, there's nothing more exciting than local church ministry. This is what God is doing in the world today. There's lots of other things that are happening out there. But as it relates to his primary focus, when one studies, even as we did in our ABF or in our Sunday school hour, what God is doing is he is building a building, he's creating a body, and he's developing a bride, and that bride and that building and that body is the church. This is where God's focus is. This is where the manifold wisdom of God is being displayed to all powers and principalities. When the angelic forces look down, even this morning, and they see that God has brought together this eclectic group of individuals, all for the express purpose of, with one mind and with one mouth, singing praise to him. And the angels step back and they go, wow, who would have ever thought? I love local church ministry. And even as we served in Wisconsin, to go from 3 families and to see the Lord develop that ministry, develop those friendships. And I'll be honest with you, one of the hardest things that I have done, certainly within the context of my ministerial life, is to leave that local church. Dear friends, many of which, last week I actually had the privilege of standing behind the pulpit and preaching to that church. And looking at individuals that in coffee shops, we've either led them to the Lord or discipled them. And to see a group of 3 families, and this was a unique situation, and God chooses to do this, to go from 3 families to last week. There were around 375 there in the service. And many of them new believers. It was overwhelming. And I'll be honest with you, last Sunday as I stood in the pulpit, tears filled my eyes because I stopped and I thought, Lord, what a joy. But at the same time, I will also add this, it was painful. You know, transitions in life are not always easy. Transitions mean that you leave one thing behind and you have to embrace something new. And what you leave behind is well known, it's well established. But what you're moving toward is unknown and is unestablished. And there are all types of questions that arise when those transitions take place. And there are fears that accompany those transitions. And there's always a little bit, and at least I'll speak transparently within my own soul, there's always a little bit of complaining that's involved with that. Well, Lord, why? I don't understand. And then that complaining many times is followed by a spirit of comparison. I get to the new situation and I stop and I look back and I say, well, Lord, it's not as good as, and again, my mind and my heart can begin to overflow with thoughts that I know have really no place within the heart and the mind of God. But transitions also provide God an opportunity to stretch us, to grow us, to encourage us to take steps of faith. Now, stretching and growing in steps of faith, we know from a cliche perspective that they're all healthy. But from a personal perspective, we stop and we say, well, I know that stretching is good for me, but it hurts. Steps of faith are vital to the Christian life, but there are unknowns that are there. And when those things happen, what we find is that many times our song within the context of our heart is taken. Psalm 61, which was read for us this morning already, I have found to be a solace within my own heart over the course of the last couple of months. David begins, and if you'll turn there and follow with me, David begins, even as was read twice now, hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer. From the end of the earth will I cry unto thee. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. Recently heard a story. It was sent to me. And to the best of my knowledge, it's actually a true story. Came out of a small-town newspaper. Within small-town newspapers, all types of little mundane stories, I think, get picked up and shared. And this was actually the story of a little parakeet by the name of Chippy. And the story, in essence, is told how Chippy's owner was moving to clean Chippy's cage. And so she opened the door of Chippy's cage there, and there Chippy was, just kind of singing away. And she had a little vacuum cleaner that she was using to clean up all of the things that were inappropriate to the cage, and she stuck the vacuum cleaner within the cage, and at that point in time, her phone rang. So she turned to pick up her phone, and as she turned to pick up her phone with her right hand, the left hand holding the vacuum cleaner kind of tilted up, and the next thing she knew, even as she was saying hello, there was this sound of slop, and she turned around to realize that the vacuum cleaner had actually sucked Chippy right into the vacuum cleaner. Well, she immediately set the phone down, opened up the vacuum cleaner, ripped open the bag of the vacuum cleaner, and there was poor Chippy, alive but stunned. So she did what any compassionate bird owner would have done. She took that little bird and she ran to the bathroom and she turned on cold water and she put the bird underneath the cold water and began to clean the bird off, kind of, feather by feather, to make sure that all the dust and the soot had been removed, and then realized that she was holding the bird, that the bird was beginning to shiver because of the coldness of the water. So she turned and grabbed her hairdryer and blasted the pet with hot air. Well, again, small-town newspapers, nothing else to report on. Apparently, the reporter followed up a few days later and said, so how is Chippy recovering? And the bird owner simply replied by saying this, well, Chippy is okay. The only problem is he just sits and stares. He doesn't sing much anymore. I heard the story, and obviously there's a little bit of an element of humor found within the story, but I think there's also some spiritual truth in it. Any of us that have lived the Christian life for any period of time, we have been in that situation where we feel like we're being sucked in, washed up, and then blown over. And when that happens from a spiritual perspective, we find ourselves just sitting and staring. And that song, which should be resonating out of our heart on a consistent basis, that song just gets lost. We know that Ephesians chapter 5 tells us that as we are being filled with the Spirit, that we are to be singing within ourselves psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. In other words, that's not the verse there is not speaking merely of corporate singing within a church body. That is the internal song that ought to be resonating and filling the chambers of our soul on a consistent basis. And that song is produced because of the song of redemption. And it should be consistent. And the volume should be high. So regardless of the situations in life, there is this internal peace that sustains us. But I would dare say that most of us have had times where at least the volume has turned down, if not the song has been muted altogether. Perhaps even within the course of the last week or so, you have found that there's been some news that has come across your life's path, some unexpected bend in the road where there's a family news, or there's financial situation, or physical news where you stop and you say, Lord, where is that song? I've lost it. And more importantly, we simply say, Lord, how can I have that song restored within my life? And really, that's what takes us to Psalm 61. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. We've all had our heart overwhelmed with pain before. We all know what that feels like, but what is striking to me about this particular psalm is not merely the reality of our heart being overwhelmed with pain, it's actually where the psalm ends. Even as it was read earlier, look at verse 8. David says this, so will I sing praise unto thy name forever, that I may daily perform my vows. So what we have is we have David who moves from a heart that's overwhelmed with pain to lips that are overflowing with praise. And when I read this psalm, and even as I've meditated on this psalm in recent days, I've stopped and I've said, Lord, how do I do that? How do I move from a heart that's overwhelmed with pain to lips that are overflowing with praise? And more importantly, as I read the psalm, I ask the question, how do you do it so quickly? David does it in 8 verses. Sometimes when my heart's overwhelmed with pain, it takes 8 hours, 8 days, 8 weeks, 8 months to have that song restored within my heart. So our task this morning is really very, very simple. We're just going to walk through the psalm. And we're going to ask the simple question, how do we go from a heart that's overwhelmed with pain to lips that are overflowing with praise? What steps does David take to get through this particular process? And just so that we're on the same page here, this particular type of psalm is called a lament psalm. Sometimes when we think of the word lament, we have almost a funeral dirge in mind, and we think in terms of caskets. We think in terms of darkness. Let me take that word lament and just put it in simple 21st century terms. A lament psalm is nothing more than a complaint psalm. It's David saying, I don't like my situation. And sometimes what David is complaining about is something that's happening external to him by way of circumstances. Sometimes what David complains about is something that is vertical. It seems that God has left him in some ways. And sometimes what David is complaining about is an internal issue. His emotions just don't seem to be corresponding with the truth that is around him. And what I love about the Psalms, and what we probably all love about the Psalms, is that the Psalms are not written for like the ivory towers of academia. The Psalms are written for the marketplace. And 72 of the 150 Psalms are lament Psalms or complaint Psalms. It's David or other writers of the Psalm simply saying before God, utterly transparently, God, I don't like something. And I need you to fix me. Now, what I just said is going to be important, and I'm going to come back to it. It's not, Lord, I need you to fix it. It's, Lord, I need you to fix me. So, let's look at David's complaint and kind of walk through it. Psalm 61, he begins, hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. What is it that's prompting this overwhelming sense within David's life? If you allow me, I'm going to survey it just very quickly. We won't necessarily turn there. But most would suggest that this psalm, along with two others, was written at a time when Absalom had dethroned David. Let me give you a quick sense of what's going on in David's life at this point in time. I'm actually going to pick it up by way of the narrative in 2 Samuel chapter 13. Many of you will know these stories, so let me just summarize them. David has multiple wives, and thus he has multiple children that have kind of unique relationships with one another. He has a daughter by the name of Tamar, and Tamar was extremely beautiful to look upon. She has an older brother by the name of Absalom, and Absalom was the oldest of David's boys, the one who from a physical perspective was very attractive, and from a leadership perspective really kind of carried the day when he walked into a room. Now, Absalom and Tamar were natural brothers and sisters. Then you had another son. The other son was a man by the name of Amnon. Amnon was obviously a half-brother to Absalom and to Tamar. Whereas the story is told, Amnon looks at his half-sister Tamar, and he desires her. Amnon had a friend, and this friend gave poor advice to Amnon, whereby he goes into Tamar's chambers, and with utter lack of decency, he violates his own half-sister. And what he does is a shame all throughout Israel, and particularly a shame within the family. Well, Absalom, Tamar's older brother, takes note of what Amnon does and plots a course of revenge. And after a period of time, he invites Amnon to a party, and as Amnon walks into this particular party, Absalom then slays him. Now, Absalom has revenged his sister, but at the same time, he's committed cold-blooded murder. And because of that, the Mosaic law comes into effect, and Absalom now is worthy of death. So instead of accepting his fate, he flees the country. Within a very brief period of time, I want you to think about the heart of a father here. You have a father who has a daughter that has been violated by a half-brother. You have a son who did the violation and now has been murdered. And you have another son who's the murderer. Now, sometimes when we read these stories within the context of the Old Testament, they just seem so two-dimensional, so black and white. But for a moment, place yourself within the heart of David. How would a father respond to that? I think the answer is actually found for us in verse 2. When my heart is overwhelmed. The story doesn't end there. One of David's chief counselors, a general by the name of Joab, actually plots with Absalom, brings him back into the kingdom. Absalom then taking opportunity to take old David, in essence to dethrone him, to force David to abdicate the throne. Absalom comes marching into the front door of Jerusalem, the horns are blazing, and he's proclaiming himself king. David now knows that his life is in danger, so he dresses himself in sackcloth and ashes, and he escapes out the back door of Jerusalem. And even as he is escaping out the back door of Jerusalem, he's marching up a hill, barefooted, dressed in sackcloth and ashes, and there's a man standing on the side of the hill by the name of Shimei, who is actually a descendant of King Saul. And Shimei is picking up rocks and he's throwing them at David. And he's saying, David, you're getting exactly what you deserve because of what you did to King Saul. David then escapes out to an area called the wilderness of Zin, seemingly goes into the back of a cave. He's surrounded by a group of loyal men, but now he is disassociated from his kingdom. He's disassociated from the temple of God. There's a distance between he and his family, and he seemingly has nothing. He's in exile. In that context, David writes Psalm 61. Let's go back to our core question. How do we go from a heart that's overwhelmed with pain to lips that are overflowing with praise? Let's just walk through the simple path that David takes us through. We've already read verses 1 and 2, but I think verses 1 and 2 actually serve as kind of the foundation for everything else that's going to be said. How do we do this? We begin by supplication to God. How do we restore the song within our hearts after it's been taken from us or after the volume has been turned down? The very first thing that David does is he falls on his face before God and he says, "Hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer." Now, this is going to be very important because we're going to look at the request that he makes in verse 2 in just a moment. But what's important about this is recognizing what God himself says about David. In 2 Kings, David asked for permission to build the temple. And God's response to that is, "Not you, but your son will do this." And the reason it's not going to be you, David, is because you are a man of action. You are a man who has blood on your hands. You are a man of military might. You're not the one that really has earned the right to build the temple. Now, when I think about that, and then when I see David's response to this, it's striking to me. Let me just ask a simple question, and you can answer it within the context of your own heart. When you get that bend in the road happening, when you have that unexpected circumstance, when you have your song stolen, what is your first natural response? I know what mine is. Mine is to put together a plan to get myself out of it. All right, Lord, this is what's gone wrong, and you have given me wisdom, you have given me some ability, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit down, and I am going to put together step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and those 5 steps are going to get me out of this situation, and then what I'm going to do, because I'm a very spiritual person, after I put the steps together, I'm going to pray. Now, God, here's my plan. Please bless it. As I move forward, you bless, because our natural tendency is to be self-dependent. Our natural tendency is to say, God, I'm going to put together the plan, and then I'm going to be spiritual enough to ask you to bless it. But ultimately, the goal for my plan is to get me out of whatever the situation happens to be. If it's a financial situation, I've got my steps. All right? If it's a family situation, 1, 2, 3. If it's a physical situation, all right, I've got to think through. What do I need to do? And I love what David illustrates for us here. David, being a man of action, seemingly has learned at this stage in his life that the first responsibility he has is not his own. First responsibility he has is simply to fall on his face before God and to declare his dependence upon God. Because really, what is prayer? When we pray, we're certainly not giving to God information he's not aware of. We know that because of the book of Matthew. When we pray, the Father already knows what we're asking. But our prayer then is a declaration of our dependence upon him. That's what it is primarily. Right. Second thing I'll note, even as it relates to this supplication, is the request that David is making. There's actually only one request found in the totality of the psalm. And the request is found in verse 2, where David says this, "Lead me to the rock that is higher than I." All right. David first recognizes that he will not move forward in independence, but he will move forward in dependence upon God. Second, he sets as his target not the extrication out of his situation, but he declares his desire to see God. God, in the midst of this, lead me to you. Now, I don't think it is wrong when we pray to actually make specific requests of God. I don't think it's wrong to say, Lord, I would love for this physical illness to be removed. I would love for this family situation to be dealt with. I love for this financial challenge to be addressed. I would love for my work situation to change. I think we have the right and open transparency to do that, but that is not the primary purpose of prayer. The primary purpose of prayer, and really the primary purpose of trials, is to remind us of our need not for a change in situation, but for a focus on an individual. And the individual that David's pursuing is the rock that is higher than he is. Lord, as the swells roll around me, as I feel like my heart is overwhelmed, as I feel like I'm drowning, just pull me up and let me stand upon the rock. The storm may still be there, but grant me the joy of safety in who you are. It's the second thing I note about the supplication. There's a third thing that I note about the supplication, and it's simply this. There's a little phrase there, and it's found in verse 2, where it says this. It says, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. I'm going to change the wording of it just for a moment, because I think it better communicates what David is saying as far as the text is concerned. In essence, what David is saying is this. He's saying, Lord, cause me to be led to this rock. Now, that's going to be important, because David is acknowledging something within his own heart, and what he's acknowledging is this, is that within the context of his own heart, he even needs the Lord to do a work within his heart to cause him to seek the rock. Lord, my natural tendency is to fix this situation, so create within me a desire for you as I go through this. See if I can illustrate it this way. George Mueller, who is the famous prayer warrior of the orphanages of Bristol, England, back in the 18th century, was known for his prayer life, phenomenal prayer life. And someone asked him, what is the secret of his prayer life? And his response to it was simply this: I've learned to pray until I have no will of my own. I want you to think about that. I have learned to pray until I have no will of my own. I think what George Mueller was hitting on there is exactly what David was talking about here. Lord, cause within me an emptiness of my own will and a pursuit of you and you alone. Again, for me, I'm a visual person, and perhaps the best way of communicating it visually, as I was growing up, I have an older brother. And my mom, being a wise woman, in the summertime, particularly when it was nice outside, would take the two of us and she would say, outside you go. Okay, you can come back in for lunch, you can come back in for dinner, and anytime you need something to drink, you can come in, and here are 2 glasses. Knowing our tendency, we would go to the cupboard every single time we wanted a drink. And she would say, here are 2 glasses, and you're only allowed to use those 2. Okay? Now, your responsibility is you can drink out of them, but after you drink out of them, you must wash them out and leave them in that same spot. That prevented a whole shelf of dirty dishes at the end of the day. So we would come back in after playing a little football or a little baseball, and my brother, he'd take his glass and he would fill it with cold water and he would drink it, and then he'd take the glass and he'd say, watch this, Brian. And after he would drink it, he'd just put it right back up in the cupboard. I go, okay, you're older than I am and obviously wiser. And so I would take my glass, my favorite drink, and even to today, is cold milk. So I would pull out cold milk and I would pour it in that glass, and I'd drink my glass of milk, and I just put it right back up in the cupboard, and I say, I got it, John. And then we'd run outside, and within moments, all of a sudden, I would hear my mother yelling out the back door for my name. And I would come in, and she'd say, Brian, you did not wash out your glass. And the punishment for that was having to do the dishes after dinner. And I'd say, well, no. But John didn't either. And she would pull his glass out, and she would look at his glass, and she'd say, yes, he did. But my glass had a particular white residue in it that sold me out. And of course, my brother, being the dirty, rotten sinner that he is, would come in and say, I told him, Mom, I promise you. I mean, it's all his fault. I'd simply say this: sometimes when we pray, when our hearts are overwhelmed, we pray as if we are pouring milk out before God. We pour out most of our pain, most of our desires, but we keep a little bit of residue of personal self-will there. Lord, get me out of this situation, but let me tell you how to do it. Get me out of this situation, but I want you to protect my reputation as we do it. Lord, get me out of this situation, but I have a certain expectation. And my certain expectation is that this is what's going to happen. So God, you can have most of my pain, but when David says, lead me to the rock that is higher than I, or cause me to be led, what he's doing is he's pouring out his heart before God as if it was a glass of water. And he's simply saying, Lord, all I want through this is you and you alone. It's the first step in David going from a heart that's overwhelmed with pain to lips that are overflowing with praise. It is honest, transparent, wholehearted supplication to God. Now, look at verses 3 and 4 with me. Because in verses 3 and 4, there's obviously a change in focus here. Verses 3 and 4, David simply says this: For thou hast been a shelter for me and a strong tower from the enemy. I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. I will trust in the cover of thy wings. Now, you note the change there. And even as I read that, I want you just to note a couple of other things. Look at the differences between verses 3 and 4. And then also look at the development of the figures of speeches. Now, broadly speaking, what is David doing? He's going from a supplication to God. Now there's an affirmation of the person of God. David has moved from cause my heart to be led to the rock that is higher than I. Now his focus in verse 3 is on God himself. And even as you noted verse 3, you'll note that David's focus is past tense. He's talking about completed action. Lord, you have been a shelter for me. You have been a strong tower from the enemy. And then in verse 4, there is almost a future sense to it. There is a request. I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. I will trust in the cover of thy wings. I long to do that as far as the future is concerned. So this is important because think about this just at a very personal level. When your heart is overwhelmed with pain, where do your eyes turn to? What is your focus on? I know what happens for me. I turn and look right here. My focus now is on the here and the now, and it's on me. Lord, here I am. Everything is out of control. David doesn't do that. In the midst of this painful scenario, what David does is he lifts his head up and he turns it backwards and he looks to the past and he says, God, I remember what you've done for me in the past. And you can't help but think that David's looking back there and he's thinking of Goliath and he's going, boom, down goes the giant. God, you did that. Running from King Saul, God, you preserved my life. Getting ultimately into the throne, God, you did that. And so David starts reflecting, he starts ruminating, he starts meditating on all the good things that God has done in his past. And then he just jumps all the way to the future and he says, now God, this is what you promised me as far as the future is concerned. Lord, I will abide in thy tabernacle. I will be under the cover of your wings. So in the midst of his painful situation, he takes his eyes off of the circumstances and he lifts them up and he looks backwards and then he looks forward. And it's not circumstances that he's looking at. It's the incredible power and the providence of God. What David is doing is he's affirming the person of God. He's meditating on his character. He's considering his grace, his mercy, his sovereignty, his power, his trustworthiness, his dependence. And he's stopping, he's saying, God, when I view you, my circumstances are so small. When I see what you've done in my past, how can I doubt what you will do as far as my present is concerned? When I consider your promises for the future, why do I feel overwhelmed at this moment? David goes from supplication to God to an affirmation of the person of God. And he does it by meditating on God's past provisions and future promises. That's not always easy to do. But I love what David does here also by way of illustration. I ask you to note the four figures of speech. See the development. There's a shelter, there's a strong tower, there's a tabernacle, and there's the shelter or the cover of your wings. What do you sense in that? From my perspective, what I sense is personal development. It's one thing to call God a shelter and a strong tower. It's another thing to view yourself as a little chick dwelling underneath the cover of God's wings. Each one of those figures of speech gets increasingly more personal. So the more that David is meditating on the person of God, the more personal God becomes to him. And really, the more secure he feels. So that by the time he gets to the end of verse 4, he's stopping and he's going, man, I'm just a little chicken. God's a big chicken. And he's just covering me completely. He is not going to allow me to be overwhelmed by this storm. Because God's bigger than that. David goes from supplication to God to affirmation of the person of God. And then he moves on. And again, you'll sense a complete change of tone here. Verses 5, or picking it up in verse 5, 6, and 7. He says, for thou, O God, you have heard my vows. You have given me to the heritage of those that fear thy name. You will prolong the king's life and his years as many generations. He shall abide before God forever. Oh, prepare mercy and truth which may preserve him. Now David is going from a situation where he's not just viewing God upwardly. Now he's looking at life as a whole, and he's making certain declarations of trust. Lord, you have heard my prayer. Now, I want you to note something just from a very practical perspective. Has David's situations changed at all? He's still back in the wilderness of Zin. He's still exiled from his throne. He's still separated from his family. His situation hasn't changed, but what has prompted this declaration of trust is step number 2, an affirmation of the person of God. And now that he has reminded himself of who God is, now he looks forward and he says, God, there are certain things that I can bank on. I can bank on the fact that you're going to prolong the king's life. Now, I think what David was doing there specifically was he was reflecting back on the Davidic covenant of 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God said, hey, I will preserve your life, and your son will be the next king. And I think David was stopping and he's looking at his current situation and he was saying, God, I don't know how this situation with Absalom is going to be resolved, but I do know this, that you're a God who keeps promises. And I have a promise from you. And I'm banking on it. When our hearts are overwhelmed with pain, we look first to God in supplication. We meditate on who he is, recognizing he's the all-sufficient one. And then we start claiming specific promises and we declare our trust in those promises. God, you have promised that all things will work together for good. God, you have promised to provide my every need. Not my every want, but my every need. Lord, you have promised, and that's exactly what David is doing. And not only is he just claiming these promises, but he's connecting the promises to the very character of God that he's been meditating on. Specifically in this passage, he's been meditating on God's truthfulness and on God's mercy. Verse 6 and verse 7. He shall abide before God forever. Oh, prepare mercy and truth. Think about David's situation. No doubt in my mind there is a part of David that is looking at his present exile and he's saying, God, I deserve this because of my sin with Bathsheba. You told me that there would be consequences to my sin, and I'm suffering the consequences to my sin. But what I need right now is mercy. Lord, there are people that are making accusations about me, and they're not founded. So what I need right now is truth. What David is doing is he's connecting his own needs with the provision that God has promised him. And he's claiming those promises to work them out as far as his life is concerned. David goes from supplication to God, an affirmation of the person of God as far as the psalm is concerned, a declaration of trust in God because he's claiming these promises. And then finally there's this last step. And this last step is actually found in verse 8 where he says this, "So will I sing praise unto thy name forever, that I may daily perform my vows." Let me just note a couple things quickly here. When our hearts are overwhelmed with pain, what is our natural response? Again, sometimes our natural response, and I think David notes them here, are kind of twofold. One, we've already noted, that the praise gets shut out of our life. The volume gets turned down. The song gets muted. The second thing that many times will happen is there's a certain paralysis that sets in. I just can't function. And sometimes it evidences itself in very real ways. I just can't get out of bed this morning. I just feel overwhelmed. I just can't go to work. I just don't enjoy church. I just don't want to serve at church anymore because I just feel all knotted up inside. What I love about David's final step here, which is a proclamation of praise, is not only does he proclaim praise, but he also disconnects himself from a paralysis. He says, "Lord, I will sing thy praise, and Lord, I will perform my vows. I will step out. I will fulfill responsibilities and duties, even when it's difficult. I won't allow circumstances to dictate to me. What I will allow is God to empower me to overcome them." Now again, from my perspective, I think one of the most difficult verses of all the New Testament is in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, where Paul writes to the Thessalonians and he says, "In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you." Folks, that's tough. In everything give thanks? I'm very personal here. Moving to Detroit, give thanks. I remember when I told my unsaved barber that I was moving to Detroit, and he stopped cutting my hair. He turned around and he looked at me face to face and said, "What are you thinking?" And I smiled and I went, and he knew I was a believer, and I simply said, "This is what God has for me. This is my next step in ministry. And I know that. And I'm going." When the physical challenges come, not just accept them, but give thanks for them. When the individual that you thought was a friend stabs you in the back with cruel words, not just accept them, but give thanks for them. When the financial challenge comes, don't just accept it, but give thanks for it. Where David concludes this psalm of complaint is with a proclamation of praise, because when we learn to give thanks to God for everything, what we are declaring to God is that He is God, that He is sovereign, that He has the right to order our life as He sees fit, and that we are small, and that ultimately the goal for our life is not our happiness. The goal for our life is His glory as He conforms us to Christ's likeness. And part of that means the acceptance of painful circumstances. And when they come, we will not respond as the world does, with complaints and with gloom and with doom. What we will do is we will proclaim our praise to God, and they will look upon us and they will say, "Wow, what kind of God do you serve, that you can give thanks to them in the midst of this?" And then you can say, "Let me tell you about that God." Until we have taken the fourth step of a proclamation of praise, we have not biblically fulfilled the process of complaining, moving from a heart that's overwhelmed with pain to lips that are overflowing with praise. I love the psalm. I love the psalm because it connects with where we are in real life. I love the psalm because David models for us what's happening. I love the psalm because within the context of my own sanctified imagination, I can just imagine David sitting in the back of the cave there. And again, his soldiers gathered around, no doubt the generals sitting beside the fire, and they're kind of doing the strategic plan. How are we going to get back to Jerusalem? And then all of a sudden, in the back of the cave, they hear David, and David starts singing. Probably just with a quiet voice, starts singing one of his psalms, and his voice starts lifting up, and as the sweet psalmist of Israel is singing, suddenly those people that are around him start singing that familiar psalm with him. And then suddenly that whole camp that at one point was just absolutely covered with the dirge of separation now becomes filled with the song of praise. And it's because David is accepting God for who he is. And in the midst of this significant transition in his life, he's saying, God, all I want is you. And I will praise you for it. Friends, let me say this. If it hasn't happened, let me assure you, your hearts will be overwhelmed with pain. I dare say many times over. I encourage you to go back to Psalm 61. Affirm who God is. Go before him and say, attend in my prayer. Lord, I need you. Lead me to the rock that's higher than I. Meditate on what he's done in your past and what he promises to do in the future. Claim the promises of God, and then lift your song up in praise. Don't just spiritually sit and stare, but allow the Spirit to fill you with a song that resonates so that all the world knows that you're a child of the King. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your goodness. Lord, thank you for this psalm, which has such practical overtones for